morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to another Supatease video. And obviously, picking a specialization for an expansion can be a very difficult decision. You might find yourself bouncing between characters just left and right, not really able to commit to everything because there's a lot of variables to consider. So the purpose of today's video is to help you make your selection based on the level of difficulty each of these specializations will challenge you to. So if you're looking for something that's very casual, you can log in with a few hours a week and kind of smash out some of your goals without a ton of effort, you're going to want to pick one of the specializations that ends up on the very easy tier. Whereas if you're looking for something that's more complex, it's going to challenge you and it's going to require this pursuit of mastery over a longer period of time, and you want that fulfillment, then you're likely going to want to select something on the very hard portion of this. And then we've got everything in between as well. And if you want to make sure you're staying up to date with news related to World of Warcraft, educational and entertaining content, then make sure to smash that subscribe button. Your support is greatly appreciated. But we got a lot of specializations to rank here. We're going to be doing our best to rank them all. So let's start things off here with the Affliction Warlock. And I think that this is going to be a very difficult one to play. It has a lot of juggling when it comes to damage over time effects. It still has a respectable amount of keybinds, even despite the amount of pruning that's come through. But I think the main difficulty is just maintaining dots on multiple targets. Now, Seed of Corruption spamming in PvE might be a bit easier, but in PvP, it's going to be very hard. So I'd say it's between hard and very hard if you're considering all content in the game at this point in time. And I'm going to sit on that basically until I die. I think Affliction Warlock might be one of the most complicated specs of all of them right now as far as pursuits of mastery and the amount of value that you're going to be able to get out of this specialization. Arcane Mage, I still think is very challenging. They have reduced Mage keybinds significantly. You've lost a ton of utility and a lot of damage reduction cooldowns, and now those damage reduction cooldowns are more like cheeky utility, like invisibility just to stop a cast on yourself as opposed to reduce damage, mirror images to provide snares and things like that. So you can still use them in cheeky scenarios, but it has had a lot of its keybind stripped away. However, its current playstyle it's not super complex in PvE as far as just spamming barrage, but in PvP, where you have to like line up these perfect moments and get these big barrage hits, can be more complicated than a lot of other specializations. And I think because you have to still hardcast pretty frequently, you still only have one school of magic, which is also something important to consider for Affliction, since they lost Malefic Rapture. You only spam UA, which means you have no secondary school of magic. So if you're getting interrupted a lot, you just can't do anything. And that's a big level of difficulty when it comes to a caster. I think it's probably still fair to say that Arcane will be very hard. I don't see somebody logging on this for the first time and just like easily crushing it on whatever content it is that they're going into, whether it's PvE or PvP. I think it'll still be likely very hard, even despite all the pruning that's come through to it. Arms Warrior still got a decent amount of keybinds. Not too much has changed. They've incorporated Slam a lot more with the Apex talents, where it can upgrade now into Heroic Strike, providing you armor penetration. So I think that it ends up feeling at least a little bit moderate as far as melee difficulty, and keeping tracks of stacks on Demolish if you're running that with the Colossus tree can be difficult. And lining up a bunch of your cooldown windows with your haste can still be decently difficult. So for me, I think Arms Warrior is probably a moderate level melee, regardless of content that you're going into for PvE or PvP. Assassination Rogue, another one that's focused on bleed damage. Now, they are making it easier to spread your bleeds to multiple targets with the rework that's come into this, but it's still a little bit more complex than a lot of other melee. I think when it comes to melee, the tiers of difficulty is like, how many buttons is your rotation? How much utility do you have that like frequently has to be used? And then do you have to manage debuffs or buffs? Do you have to manage cooldowns and lining your cooldowns up? Well, Assassination Rogue has quite a lot of that. So I think for me, I'm going to put Assassination Rogue as hard, regardless of the content. Hey, I caught myself there and didn't say irregardless. I want you guys to give me credit for that in the comments down below. But I would say Assassination is still going to be a decently respectable level of difficulty when it comes to Rogue. Augmentation, again, it's its own unique playstyle, right? Keeping up Ebon Might as much as possible. That is different than a lot of the other caster DPS, so it might come across a little bit more challenging in that regard, and keeping track of where all the buffs are going. I think it's likely just like kind of like a moderate level of difficulty. It might be honestly hard. It depends on if they decide to make it in PvP, at least if it's a cheesy one-shot spec. Pulling off that one shot can be difficult if you don't understand the sequence. But once you understand the sequence, it becomes very easy. So those types of specializations are usually tough to rank. I think it's probably fair to put it more in the moderate section though at the moment. When it comes to tanks, I personally think Brewmaster is just like the hardest tank, and then most of the other tanks are really easy. They've made tanking in general just very easy, just a lot of keybinds reduction. You're kind of just spamming a couple of buttons. So honestly, this is probably like one of the best expansions to come in onto tank. I think Blood DK before had a little bit more management than in previous expansions, but in this one I think it's really just straightforward and just spam. And I'm slapping Guardian Druid up there along with Blood DK as well. Beast Mastery Hunter, our first very easy range specialization. They made it even easier. I was talking about, tracking buffs, tracking debuffs. You don't have to track buffs anymore with barbed shots. So they've removed one level of complexity onto the specialization. So a lot of your stuff is just passive proccing, and you just kind of just spam. So it is very easy. Brewmaster, I think, is still definitely a challenging tank. I'm going to put it on hard. I think managing the stagger mechanic is just a little bit more difficult than a lot of the other healers that were more reactionary. Feral Druid has been made easier, but I think relative to the other DPS is still very challenging. They've added new features like snapshotting bleeds, and then, well, that's not a new feature, but they've added a new animation for it, so your bleeds change colors, so it makes it a bit easier to manage, like whether you've got snapshotted bleeds or not. But even just that alone, even without Blood Talons in the equation, I think Feral is still probably the hardest melee DPS of everything else. You've got shapeshifting to take into account. You've casted crowd control. You have a ton of utility that you can exploit as well, whether it's decursing allies or knocking enemies on casts or cycloning players in PvP. It has a huge variety of stuff to do. While it was made easier, I think it is still likely the most challenging melee DPS available in the pool right now. Balanced Druid, I think, is still easy. It's just keep dots up, Incarn, spam Star Surge. The new Eclipse is basically just you button press to get into Eclipse as opposed to pressing 2 Wraths. It is an extra keybind there, but they did remove Renewal, so you don't have a little bit less personal healing management. Although then they changed Heart of the Wild, made a 2-minute cooldown, so it's kind of like a pseudo renewal when you're in bear form, because it gives you extra stamina for frenzied regen. But I think Bootkin is still pretty easy out of the range DPS. It really comes down to tuning, at least in PvP, as to whether it's difficult or not. But in PvE, I think it's pretty simple. Just keep dots up and spam your spenders, Starfall for AoE, Star Surge for single target. But in PvP, if your survivability is low, it can become more difficult. But right now, it feels pretty easy from my personal testing. Devourer, Demon Hunter. Honestly, this one I think is a little bit more complex. It's got a lot of different nuance to it than Havoc has, as far as building up shards and trying to time for these big collapsing star windows and how you're going to line those cooldowns up, especially in a PvE environment. I think it's going to be very difficult. In PvP, it's kind of a cheesy one-shot spec. So again, those specs can be very hard if you don't know how to set them up. But it really depends on if they tune it or not. So I think probably like a safe middle ground for Devourer is probably a moderate level of difficulty. Now, if we're talking like 1v1 PvP, it'll feel very easy because you're very tanky and you don't take a lot of damage. And if you can set up the one-shot, you one-shot almost anything in the game at the moment. But I think moderate's probably a more fair place for it across the game as a whole. Demonology, I think Warlock specs in general are very complicated just because you have a bunch of different like buff sequences to manage, especially when you're setting up to get your big Tyrant out. They've added extra utility now. You can have the ability to spell lock on top of Axe Toss, so that's extra demand on you as a ranged DPS. And you have spammable crowd control, so tracking diminishing returns is another element of complexity. I think Affliction is a little bit more challenging than Demonology, mostly because a lot of your damage is passive from pets, as opposed to Affliction. If you're not managing your dots properly, you're doing nothing. So I think for Demonology, I'll just say at the moment it's hard, but Affliction is slightly more difficult. Destruction Warlock, I want to put this on very easy. I'm not going to lie. I think it's really straightforward now. You just keep Immolate up, Conflagrate, and spend shards on Chaos Bolt or Rain of Fire. It's very similar to Boomkin as far as like its resource expenditure, although Boomkin has a little bit more utility defensively, with decursing things off of allies, roots and cyclones. Warlock is a little bit more instant CC. I think the reduced cooldown on Howl of Terror is actually going to be really good in PvE for just AoE interrupts as well. But I honestly want to say, like, is it really as easy as BM? I think just the fact that you have to cast makes it harder than BM Hunters, because you have to deal with interrupts. So if I was going to put this like in a fair spot, I think it'll be slightly harder just because of the necessary necessity to deal with interrupts. Devastation Evoker, nothing's really changed except that you just get to fly twice. Azure Strike's a little bit more brought into your rotation, but it also can depend on what hero talents you're playing. I think Devastation, probably a fair spot to put it at the moment, is like easy or very easy. The reason I want to put it on very easy is that Obsidian Scales makes you hyper mobile, really tanky. At least in PvP, you go immune to interrupts. In PvE, if you could immune to interrupts, then maybe it would be the same for Beast Mastery Hunter. But overall, it's somewhere between easy, somewhere between Easy and very easy in my mind for Devastation. Discipline Priest, I think, is still a very hard healer. Again, you're doing a lot of target swapping as a healer, which is what makes it challenging. You've got to target allies quickly and then switch and target enemies in order to do your rotation effectively, and juggle all of these spells in sequence in order to buff up other spells. So using Evangelism, which is a more kind of core rotation to your class, to get your Radiance to be instant, and then to buff your Penance, which then buffs your shield while also maintaining dots on everybody. It still has quite a layer of complexity to it over other healers as far as overall maintenance, which again can be a good thing or a bad thing depending on what your goals are. So do remember that this tier list is meant to align with your goals. Do you want something that's challenging, Pursuit of Mastery, or do you want something that's just easy, you can flop in a couple hours and get things done? Now, Elemental Shaman had a significant pruning. Shaman across the board had a significant pruning. Ellie is a lot more straightforward. There's a lot less spells to juggle between right now for it, but its tuning is kind of making it weak. But keeping Flame Shock up is very easy now. It's still just Flame Shock Lava Burst. I feel like the low cooldown Wind Shear does, make it a bit more challenging, and then PvP you add Grounding Totem into that, and you got a lot of disruption, so that can make it more challenging in my view than Balanced Druid or this tier up here. So I think for me, I'll probably put Ellie at the moment on moderate level of difficulty as far as casters. It still has a decent amount of keybinds as well in terms of density. But in PvE, a lot of classes are just Builder Spender. Single target or AoE is your main selection. But in PvP, it's definitely a little bit more challenging than these other guys. And also tuning, I think. The tuning could honestly make it feel like it's very hard just because you're weak. But as opposed to like mechanical demand. Enhancement Shaman is way less mechanical demanding. They've taken a lot of utility away that you could previously use in order to kind of maintain things, as well as defensive cooldown management. The rotation is a lot more straightforward. Stormstrike builds are still kind of just spamming one button. But much like Ellie, I think the low cooldown interrupt demand there could definitely add some skill expression to the mix, although Sunder now doesn't disorient, so you're losing a little bit of a stop there. You still have Cap Totem, though, for AoE stuns. I think Enhancement's probably like a moderate level of difficulty over some of the other options that you could do for melee DPS at the moment. And again, pending tuning, maybe it ends up being really hard just because it's bad, but we won't know that. I'm just talking mechanical density, right? What it feels like when you get on it, like how much processing power is this taking my brain in order to play, right? It's going to feel more like a moderate level of processing power. Frost DK, I still think is pretty straightforward. I'm going to put it onto the easy tier. They've reduced the complexity of a lot of the cooldown windows that you had previously. A lot of your buttons now just transform. So it's a very straightforward kind of cleave character that you grip targets in and do big burst damage. Doesn't seem like that's changing too much. So I'll say it's easy for now. Fire Mage, again, Mage in general, I think is often considered more complicated, but Fire Mage is like, they brought Scorch back. Hey, so you went from like 3-button rotation to like sort of 4, which is definitely an improvement. It's kind of just build up, press Pyro. I honestly think Fire is probably the easiest of all of the Mage specializations, just because it's so straightforward as far as build up and then spend with Pyroblast. So I think I'll put Fire on the easy tier for right now. And they've lost a bunch of like the utility, the knockbacks, like moments where you could have a little bit of skill expression. I think the big loss of skill expression for Mage is going to be shifting power. The cooldown reduction ability, like not having to think about it at all because it doesn't exist, is obviously going to be less demanding for the specialization. You just do damage and spam Fireball instead of having to think about how you're going to slot in a little bit of extra cooldown management into the specialization. Frost Mage, again, it's also been made easier. A lot of abilities now transform. So you Glacial Spike, Frostbolt just transforms into it. So if you're just spamming Frostbolt, it just turns into Super Frostbolt when you get enough Glacials. And a lot of your abilities just transform. So your keybind density has gone down a lot. Do I want to say Frost is a moderate level of difficulty? I think it's slightly harder than Fire, but it's pretty close. I think mostly like choosing between, like Fire is very linear, right? You Fireblast, Flame Strike, or Fireblast, Pyroblast. But Frost is kind of like, when do you Orb Blizzard? When do you Flurry? Like keep track of these stacks that you've got now of Shatter. I think it's a little bit more complicated than Fire, so I'll put it on like moderate level. Maybe hard, but I don't feel like Mage. I think Arcane is still significant. It'll feel significantly more in terms of processing power. Fury Warrior, I think, is easier than Arms as far as like bleed management, although you're getting bleeds as well, so I don't know if they're trying to like even that out. I still feel like it's a bit easier as far as processing power. I'm gonna slap this onto easy over Arms. I think Arms just a little bit harder in terms of defense management. as well, and damage mitigation. Being able to use your cooldown when you're stunned means you don't have to like premeditate the attacks. You can kind of be more reactionary, which makes it a bit easier to deal with like high damage scenarios. Havoc Demon Hunter in the War Within was very hard. I would have put it very hard. It's actually one of the hardest melee. Maybe hard, actually. I think Feral and Outlaw are still more difficult, but it was very hard. But now it's not. Like, it's really not. The changes to Essence Break, it's very simple. Just build or spender. You still have a lot of utility, so you can have a lot of skill expression there as far as carrying the game, whether it's PvE or PvP. So I think I'll probably drop it down to a moderate. It would probably move from hard to moderate as far as the expansions go, as for your own expectations. Holy Priest, oh my god, bro, this healer is so easy now. It's so easy. You have no hots to manage anymore. Renew is gone. It's just Palm, Flash, and Serenity or Sanctify. This is your go-to easy healer, in my view. You don't spend a lot of time targeting enemies either. And one of the main advantages of that is Holy Nova. You can target an ally while using Holy Nova. That's a major advantage as far as reducing the like cognitive load on your brain. So you're not like clicking across on the frames and going back or whatever, however you target. You don't have to worry about that because a lot of your damage is going to come from Holy Nova. They removed your dots, so you don't have dot management. Very straightforward, instant healing spec. Very easy. Holy Paladin, depending on the build, can be more complicated. If you play a Weapons of Order kind of melee paladin, you do have to do a lot of like targeting back and forth. You'll be in melee range in a lot of the mechanics in PvE, or having to avoid crowd control in PvP. So it can be more challenging. But I still think it's pretty easy because you have a lot of just instant casts and you have a lot of immunities, which I think makes it a bit easier to play. So I'm going to put it on easy, just a little bit under Holy Priest. Marksmanship Hunter, very easy right now. Although you do have to use Steady Shot a little bit more. I think it's not as easy as Beast Mastery with the rework that they've done to it, but I definitely would slot it in like in here with these guys. Maybe it does deserve to be on very easy. Obviously, like Hunter across the board, I think it's been simplified a huge amount. You've lost a lot of crowd control, a lot of utility, so you don't have to worry about managing that anymore. Although they did give you Roar Sacrifice in PvE now, that can be used on allies, so it's a little bit of extra responsibility from previous iterations of Hunter. But as far as rotations, cognitive load is going to be very low. Mistweaver, I think it's very challenging. Much like Discipline, you spend a lot of time bouncing between targeting enemies and targeting allies and having to weave in damage constantly with this specialization. Makes it very challenging. So honestly, I'm gonna put Mistweaver here. I think the dealing with crowd control and interrupts is also a lot more challenging on these specs, and you have a bunch of cooldowns. Even though they've brought down some of the cooldowns, you still have a lot of them to manage. I really like the talent actually now where your statue is put down passively. I can't remember what ability puts it down. Again, I'm reviewing all the specializations. My brain here is a little bit limited, but there's a new ability where now basically statue goes down through your rotation as opposed to you manually putting it down, which actually helped a lot with cognitive load, especially if you're going pole to pole or you're in a battleground or whatever and the fight's moving. You don't have to worry about that as much. Made it a little bit easier, but I think relative to the other healers, still going to feel much more challenging. Outlaw Rogue, even despite the simplicity that's been applied to it, and they've made things a little bit easier to read, I still think it's pretty hard, mostly just because it's a rogue. As far as like mitigate, I think managing Roll the Bones is still going to require a little bit more cognitive effectiveness than before, but I think Outlaw might have become a bit easier to play than Feral, mostly just because of debuff management, bleeds and snapshotting, and you don't have to worry about that. So I think Feral will feel harder, so I think it's probably a fair spot to put it somewhere here. And again, if it's performance wise, maybe it ends up feeling harder just because it's weak, but it's very tough for me to rank something based on performance right now when changes are constantly ongoing. Preservation Evoker, again, you're kind of close to the fight a lot of the time, which is again increasing the danger, which increases the cognitive load. You have to balance doing damage and healing a lot of the time to be effective and to regenerate your mana, which can be very challenging. So I think for me, Preservation Evoker is also another healer that's probably like either very hard or hard. Maybe we'll drop Mistweaver a little bit lower, just because it's you have a lot of safety net cooldowns that are still really strong. I don't know. These healers right now I think are definitely towards the more challenging end, but it's tough for me to delineate them. They're probably not all deserving of being on very hard, but there's somewhere between hard and very hard. Prot Warrior I still think is pretty. I just like the tank specs are just not really that tough. They're all, if you want to jump on like a roll, that's the challenging part of tanking is positioning and knowing the routes, but like doing the rotation of the tank is not not super challenging, right? It really depends on how they tune dungeons. If it's a kite meta where the tank is just running away and kiting, as opposed to like actually mitigating and using a rotation, all that stuff is very tough. Prot just got some really giga changes that made it really cool. And again, like I think all the tanks are pretty simple. Prot pilot a little bit harder just because you can aid your allies a bit with your cooldowns. Unlike a lot of the other tanks, they don't have to worry about like their party engagement, but it's again probably a pretty small amount difference as far as complexity. Now, Resto Druid, I think, is very challenging healer. Although they have made it simpler, Efflorescence is now just baked into Life Bloom. So if you have Life Bloom on the tank, you get Efflorescence healing on your melee all the time. So it's like auto-moving with you. And they've added that kind of like auto-moving mechanic to a lot of healers. But I think the shape-shifting, going into cat form, deciding what you're going to do, the new Heart of the Wild adds a lot of tech decisions. As far as doing damage for this one, and you've got buff management with hots, debuff management with bleeds, deciding what form you should use your Heart of the Wild burst damage, when can you get away with it. You've got Cyclone and crowd control. So like for me, I think Resto Druid is really tough, but I just feel like we're going like this is like we got so many up here. There's no way they can all be this hard, right? I don't know what I want to drop, but I'm honestly feeling like these guys are all very hard. And honestly, with the tuning at the moment, I think Mistweaver will feel easier. So maybe if I do tuning, I can move that. It's tough for me to call right now. Rep Paladin, still very easy. It's going to be the go-to. Melee DPS, you're just going to notice they have a couple less keybinds. Your defensives are easier to use because they're just baked together. You do have obviously like team utility to like be aware of allies and stuff like that every once in a while, but it's not like it's ongoing. I think you can get away with doing like not even doing a lot of the utility and kind of get away with it on Rep Paladin for the most part. Restoration Shaman, they've pruned a lot of your abilities. They've increased the cooldown of your wind shear, so you don't have to like, wind shear constantly while doing your rotation. So it's a little bit less cognitive pressure for you as a healer. A lot of instant healing still, a lot of really like automated healing as well, which is nice. I'm going to put it here on hard with the changes that they've made for it at the moment. Shadow Priest, I think, is challenging, but not as challenging as maybe in the past. So I'm going to put it on hard for right now. The ability to get dots up with Tentacle Slap is really nice, but obviously the loss of the stun makes it a bit harder to get crowd control in PvP situations on healers. But in PvE, I think its rotation has been made a lot easier than previous iterations. This might come as a surprise, but Subtlety Rogue, I'm actually putting on easy tier. They've removed Rupture, so you don't have the bleed management anymore. Buff management, they've condensed a lot of abilities together with Symbols and Dance. I think it's much more straightforward. Just pop cooldowns and go ham. This is like, if you ever wanted to play a rogue, you're worried about it being hard, play a Subtlety Rogue in Midnight, because this will be the time to get into it. Survival Hunter also has been made very easy, but it does have Tip the Spear, which I think is the only thing that makes it a little bit more challenging to justify me putting it here onto the moderate tier. Its overall rotation is way less keybinds. You'll notice that right away, but knowing how many stacks of Tip the Spear you have and what ability do you want to spend it on, I think makes it a little bit harder than some of the other melee. It's also very restrictive on mobility, much like these other three, which I think make them harder. They don't have a lot of like ranged stuff you can use anymore. So, and it has quite a few cooldowns to manage as well. Unholy DK, I will say, is probably a moderate level of difficulty. You do have debuff management with dots, but you don't have the wound expenditure anymore. A lot of the rotation is kind of more straightforward, though. They've made it a bit easier than it was, more animated, more fluid than it was. So I'd say moderate is probably a fair spot for it. Vengeance Demon Hunter, again, depends on what the meta is and depends on the tuning. I'm going to put it a little bit harder than the other tanks just because if it's kite meta, like understanding how to juggle your mobility can be a bit more challenging than the other tanks. And then Windwalker, it's probably still moderate. I think the main reason is just because you're completely gridlocked into melee. You do still have quite a few cooldowns, although they've reduced them and condensed them previously, but it'll still feel like a medium level of difficulty moving into Midnight. So this is my assessment right now as far as the Midnight beta. There might be changes. I will let you know if those changes happen, but I hope that this tier list helps you in terms of making your selection for the next expansion, because there's a lot of dimensions to consider. And other than that, thank you guys very much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.